Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish and here we are once again together to talk about cross stitch and other needlework related topics. So the last FlossTube episode, I talked about how we need to stay flexible with our to-do list. That indeed life happens, and as much as we structure our day or our week or our month with a list of what we want to do, sometimes life gets in the way. Curveballs are thrown one right after the other. So that is how 2023 started for me. I had my joy planner. I had my pages outlining what I wanted to do for January. I had the beginnings of my first couple of weeks with appointments written down and things I needed to get done. And I caught some sort of a virus. I started feeling sort of bad right before New Year's. I got that last video out, and then by New Year's Eve, I was sick. And of course, trying to find non-emergency medical help over a holiday weekend is a challenge. And so when I did get help, I was tested for all, the major three: COVID, flu, strep. Wasn't any of those. And as the nurse practitioner said, you have a good old-fashioned virus. Gave me some cough remedies, said to continue with the regimen I was doing, resting, and plenty of liquids, gargling, all the just the normal stuff. So those of you who follow me on Facebook know that I really had it bad. In fact, the first week or so, I didn't even feel like stitching. And it made me think about, your typical doctor's appointment nowadays. They will ask you, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain level? And I always find that kind of an interesting question because it certainly is relative. But to a needle worker, if I say I had a week where I didn't even take one stitch, that probably tells you more about how I felt than any other test or temperature taking or anything. So that's how I spent the first week or 10 days of 2023, was feeling so lousy I didn't even stitch. But then I remembered my good old friend needlepoint and how counted canvas work for me is very relaxing when you have a design with not a lot of color changes, or, as you can see from this piece, the color changes are very, very regular. I would do one surround of a stitch in one color, and then when I got all the way around that square, then I would switch to another color and do a different stitch. And that was about all I could manage. Plus this project is 13 mesh canvas, so very, very easy to do. Needlepoint doesn't talk about stitches per inch like counted cross stitch does. We do talk about the threads per inch, the mesh or the count. And so in this case, it's 13 threads to the inch. So this was my comfort piece that got me through the second and third week of January, and brought me to where we are right now. Also did a little bit of Bargello. Bargello, I would say that if you are a counted cross stitch enthusiast and you have thought about doing needlepoint, Bargello is an excellent first project. It's just fun. You get to really play with color, and once you get that first row established, that's really the major part of the counting. And after you get that first row set up, then the other ones just follow. So that's how I spent the first, my first stitching. So the projects that I thought I was going to work on, like Emily and Emmy, it was just too much mental work. I couldn't do it. So coming back to the idea of a to-do list, again, you just have to stay flexible. And more, I am addressing not only my monthly, my overview list, but my day-to-day list with kind of a, putting a star next to things that absolutely have to get done. And then everything else, I put a number value by it as far as how important it is. But I think the thing that I'm doing that's helping me the most is by the end of each day, I have identified something for the next day that I am really looking forward to. And as I close out the day, I really start thinking about what I need to get done the next day and what's going to give me the most pleasure. And even if it's not the thing that chronologically I can do first, I'm finding that it just gives me just that little extra, I don't know, extra little push or something. There's something about looking forward to the next day. And I will tell you that as you age, I'm in my 70s now, your outlook does start changing somewhat. And I think it's more and more important to, again, identify that thing that's going to bring you the most joy, that you're going to look forward to the next day, or in those next coming days. So anyway, that was my launch of 2023. It can only get better from here. But while I was doing my stitching and a lot of binge watching, found a couple of series that I had not seen before that I'm wondering how in the world I ever missed them. One of them being New Amsterdam. Shout out to the casting and the writers of that show. It has really, really kept me interested, as well as, oh my gosh, now I forgot what it's called, the Louise Penny TV series with Inspector Ganache. I watched that from beginning to end. So that was my binge watching. But while I was watching, while I was stitching and not watching TV, I really started thinking about the early days in my career and how in 1981, if anybody had ever said, guess what you're going to be doing in 2023? Needless to say, I could have never imagined this. And it made me start thinking about how much the cross-stitch industry has changed. And so there's a couple things I just want to share with you as far as how cross-stitch designs, the makings of them, have changed over the years. So when I first started doing counted cross-stitch as a designer, most of the designs on the market were simple Xerox copies. And I'll throw out the brand name then. We didn't call them photocopies, we called them Xerox copies because that was the company that put that whole thing on the map. And you'd go into your cross-stitch shop, and for 50 cents or $1, you would buy a simple little cross-stitch chart. Lots of local designs, iconic buildings from colleges and universities, lots of cute little sayings, things that today I would just sort of cringe and say, oh my gosh, there's no way in the world I would ever stitch that. But I was one of the designers designing that kind of stuff. But more than that, I really started thinking about how the production part has changed and how, without even leaving my house, I can go from concept to getting the design at your house. And that is not how it was in 1981 at all. So the first thing is that when we made that transition from selling photocopies to bona fide cross-stitch leaflets and booklets, one of the things that you had to do was get a professional photographer to take the picture. There was I can't remember now what the format is, but you would end up with a square, almost a square image, and it wasn't a negative, it was called a transparency. And so like a negative, that's color, anything that's green is red and anything red is green. Now, I realize a lot of you watching this have probably never even seen a negative, but trust me, that's how they were. But with a transparency, you were looking at true color. And so that was the first step. Now, of course, I take my photos with my iPhone. The next step was to take that transparency, and again, using a professional service, you had to have separations made. So let me show you what a separation looks like. So this transparency is from my book number 29, called Little Totes for Cross Stitch. Simple little designs. This was when I was working very closely with the Jan Lynn Corporation up in New England, and they manufactured these little totes, and then I created designs for them. So this is what it looked like when it was all done, and this is a transparency that was like a proof to see that the color was right. So when you look at it in this stage, it looks like regular color, but each one of these sheets, there's 4 sheets altogether, is a different color. So printing in color is done in 4 colors. There's yellow, and then magenta, blue or cyan, and then black. So it's all 4 colors in the transparency, and they represent the 4 colors that the printer uses to create the finished work. And so if you're at home thinking, oh, those are the same colors that are in the cartridges in my color printer, you're absolutely right. So that's how the color is created. So again, those were steps that took professionals. A professional photographer to create the original transparency, and then the color separation made that the printer would then use. So those are 3 steps that I imagine there are still designers using those. But at the time, in the 80s and the 90s, it was the only way to do it. Now, like I said, I can take the photo with my iPhone. There's no transparency, there's no color separations, and frankly, it looks every bit as good as what the professionals did. So that's one of the big changes. I'll have to revisit this one and see if I need to chart these and make them into a PDF. Would be interesting. So when did I do this one? This is 1987. One of the other changes is that I think is probably the only one that to me is sort of a negative, is that back in the day, we had this organization called the CDA, the Chartered Designers of America, and it was a group of professional cross-stitch designers that got together and said, you know what, we need to have standards. We need to have kind of a framework for designers to work from. Self-regulated, we came up with our own standards, and those that elected to be a part of this group just voluntarily followed them. And I think it really improved what we produced as a group for you, the consumer. And many of these standards are things that have just become so commonplace, people don't even think about them, like every 10th line being dark. Can you imagine now sitting down at a chart and not having every 10th line dark? It would drive you crazy. Or if some of them were every 8th line being dark, and you didn't know that, and you just assumed that it would be 10, and it would really mess up your counting, wouldn't it? So those are things that CDA did that I think were really, really good. And I don't know whether or not designers work together like that now or not, but it was a really good thing. And it's something that the industry really needed at the time. I think my progression as a designer is probably pretty typical of most designers of my generation. as far as how we started. So the first designs that we did were hand-drawn. And I have found one of my original charts. This is probably not the best example because it's counted thread, not counted cross stitch, but I'll be able to show you a little bit of both. So this is graph paper that I had printed. I wanted the grid to be red so that when I drew on it with the black ink, that it would be very clear as to where the stitching was. So all this is done with just an ink pen. Well, I shouldn't say just an ink pen. It was called a rapidograph, but it was liquid ink. It was not like a ballpoint pen. So all of this is done by hand, and these little open symbols were, I used an architect's template to draw them, and then the thicker ones were using a different thickness of a pen. I could get those strokes like that. And these little these symbols, I actually drew them with the template and then put little hash marks on them so that as a stitcher you would know that this was different from this, was different from this. And then had my directional written up. And just thinking about this, I really had to dig in and find what I stitched with that chart. So this is a pin that I made, that this is all just stitched on linen, and haven't worn it in a while. I'll have to think of something I can wear this pen with. So this is my very first book, the Janet Irving Sampler, that launched my career. And at the time, I really didn't know whether or not people were going to go for it, whether or not I was going to be able to make a success of this. So there's a couple things that are kind of interesting about this first book. See, book number 1. One of them is that the sample was stitched on Aida, not linen. And at the time, everybody said that no one would stitch on linen. Imagine that. So that's one thing. The other thing is the dedication, or the story about Janet and how she came to America and how she became the great-great-great-grandmother of my daughters, was all handwritten by the art teacher of the school that I was teaching at. At the time, I was teaching at Mainland Regional High School in New Jersey. I was teaching social studies, and the art teacher wrote that out for me. So that was wonderful. But all of these symbols are done, again, just with that rapidograph ink pen on my red graph paper. And again, of course, when it's printed, the graph printed in black, I only used the red because it made it easier for me to see what I was doing. But every one of these symbols, whether it's the little triangle or the N or the O or the solid ones or the X's, all of these are done by hand. Now, at the time, the other thing that you had to pay for was typesetting. And of course, since this was my first book and I didn't know whether or not it was going to go over, I was cutting costs wherever I could. So I decided that I would just do all the notes as handwritten rather than having to pay for typesetting. It's kind of embarrassing to say that now, but that's the case. Now, it did end up being a success. In fact, it's still available on my Etsy store. But when I reprinted it, I got a little bit more sophisticated in terms of the cover. And so you can see just how different the cover is the second time around. The second phase from hand drawing all the symbols was using rub-on symbols. And some enterprising person came up with symbols and sheets. I wish I still had some of these. They were about 4 by 6, and there'd be a sheet of symbols, and the graph paper that they sold was made so that it was aligned the same. So for example, in this cute little set of reindeer here, in the belly, let me see if I can get this on here right. In the belly, like all these little slash marks, that was like I could lay a sheet over there and take my pencil and rub over the other on the outside. It was like wax paper, and then peel it off, and the symbols would be there. Now, in either case, whether it was hand-drawn letters or using these rub-off symbols, you still had to count really, really carefully. And so creating a chart is not unlike stitching, as far as you had to count and say, you know, for this scarf here, to get the red and white or green and white, whatever the colors were of the scarf, I had to count, you know, how many V's in each row and when to come in and out. And then the back stitching is still done with my ink pen. I would have to do that over top of the symbols. So that's like the second way that I created charts. Now, about this time, you know, as we got into the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and home computers became more popular, and people started developing design software, I was one of the ones saying, I will never design my cross stitch on a computer screen. Because in all these cases, and these are the sort of things I kind of wish I still had to show you, like these reindeer, I first drew them out and would use usually colored pencils, sometimes watercolor. My Appaloosa Rocking Horse in particular, I do know I did as a watercolor rendering first. And then I would lay the, like a transparent grid over top of it, and would then make a sketch from that, and then make my final rendering from that. So it was a lot of different steps from concept to the finished one. Now that's still somewhat true. I mean, there's still a lot of steps between the light bulb going on and saying, oh, I think I'll do these funny little reindeer on ice skates, to where it's at a point where you, the consumer, is going to see it. So I'm not saying that that part has changed, but the physical steps as far as how I do it has certainly changed. Now, there are times that I do go back to doing a sketch first, and then, but now I can scan it and put it into my cross-stitch software. So even at that point, I can still use a computer assist to get the design to your house. And then, of course, so of course, that's what I do now, is I use computer software, and it has come a long way as far as different little steps that we can take, doing mirror images, copying a repeat motif, and just copying and pasting it, like, especially like, say, a border. So like when I did that Janet Irving sampler originally, I had to like draw that strawberry border all the way around the whole thing. There was no just taking a snapshot and copying it and pasting it all the way around. So in that regard, my work is a whole lot easier than it was before. Oh, and also, by the way, I want to talk a little bit about that photocopy to more professional printed designs. So there was a time when we legitimately sold photocopies. And I am sure that there were a lot of pirated copies at the time, but it really was the only way that you could kind of get started. Because also at the time, for it to be cost effective to print a booklet, you'd have to print 5,000 copies. So it was a lot of capital outlay to get a design just to market. So that's one thing. There was a time when, even with printed copies, for a while, one of the ways that we avoided or tried to circumvent people who wanted to pirate copies, we would do draw the symbols in red and in black. So you, for example, might have your typical triangle symbol, but a black triangle represented one color and a red triangle would represent a different color. Now, this was a time when people did not have photocopy machines at home as part of their printer, and they certainly didn't have color ones at home. So if somebody took one of these legitimate copies that were both red and black symbols and they took it to a photocopy place to have it photocopied, it would all come out as black. So therefore, the chart would be useless to them. So if you come across a chart that has both red and black symbols that are the same symbols, in other words, you have a red slash and a black slash, you have a red circle and a black circle, it's probably from those days when we were trying to avoid having our charts pirated. So in that regard, that's probably one of the things that's been a constant from the time I started my business until today, is that we designers are constantly vulnerable to people basically, I'll just use the S word, stealing our designs and either just giving them away to friends and thinking nothing of it, or selling them on eBay or in whatever way that they choose to sell them. But that part is constant, and it has driven a lot of designers away. At this point, my own personal philosophy is that they're the ones that are ultimately going to have to pay the price of cheating somebody else. And I do believe that kind of that old what goes around comes around. And I just hope that more and more people, would instead follow the golden rule and just say, I wouldn't want somebody stealing from me. I don't know any cross-stitch designer who got into this business to quote unquote make money. We try to make a living doing something that we really, really love. And I think in most cases it really shows. So anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. Okay, so what else has changed? When I first started designing, again, early 80s, Aida came in white and ecru. Then later on, like baby pink and baby blue, Christmas red, Christmas green, black. But this explosion of colors that you, the consumer, have available to you, and Aida and linen and Joberlin and all the different fabrics, is amazing compared to what was available, like I say, in the early 80s and even into the early 90s. I think that one of the best things that's happened is the availability of a variety of colors of linen and other even weave fabrics that allow us designers to have a ground cloth that we can kind of do other amazing things with it. And then, of course, the whole over-dyed trend, which is really new, is just absolutely amazing. Same thing with floss. I mean, when I first started designing, you designed with solid DMC colors. That was the standard. Very, very little with variegated threads. And then the whole thing started with the overdyed threads, and that's been incredible too. I think the biggest change has been in what designs are offered to you, the consumer. Again, when I first started, what you had were very traditional designs, cutesy, country, very, very middle America. And now I feel like that there is something out there for everyone, from the absolutely irreverent sayings that some people love to stitch, to the very, very intricate designs with 80, 90 colors. Just, there's so many different styles out there. And I think coming back full circle to how I started this this little segment. Um, I think that that's because it is so much easier to kind of put your toe in the waters and to find out whether or not there are other people out there who want to stitch what you want to stitch as a designer. Because I don't know about other designers, but I don't design things and put things out there that I'm not willing to stitch. And I think that that's true for most people. There's probably some exceptions, but I think by and large, people who design needlework are designing from the heart. And so because it is so much easier to use your phone to create a PDF, I mean, honestly, you can like launch your business for, I don't know, probably 1/100th of the amount of money that it took to launch a business in 1981. I'm not talking about the difference in dollar value, but I'm saying dollar for dollar, anything that I spent to get started was 100 times more than what a designer has to spend today to get started. And again, I'm not belly aching. Don't get me wrong. I hope it doesn't sound like that. I'm talking about the fact that that is what makes it easier to have this wide range of styles and design possibilities out there. Bottom line is that's what's great for the consumer. But you know, one of the other things that has changed that I am just finding so much delight in is how designers are collaborating with each other. When I first started, there was a keen competition between designers. I can't think of any example of anything major being launched by 2 or more designers. Things like the Jingle Ball that, like 10 companies worked together to pull that off. That just didn't happen in the 80s and the 90s. And that's one of the things I think that is absolutely priceless that's going on. And I am so excited and happy that creative people are doing that and working together and, you know, just to bring designs and events to you, the consumer. But in the end, I think that the thing that hasn't changed is our love of the craft and people's willingness to share in a positive way through social media, through events, camps, classes, retreats, where people just get together and just want to share their experiences and develop friendships with people who have this thing in common with them. That has not changed from the earliest times when people would just get together with their neighbors or sit around a table in a shop, to the more elaborate things. I think that that's one of the things that's been a constant. The fact that there's all this positive sharing going on and reaching out to other people. And of course, the thing that hasn't changed is what we stitchers get out of it. The peace of mind, just the love of creating something, the way that we can have a pastime that's so enjoyable, that's also portable, so that if you're going to a doctor's appointment, you can take it with you. If you're going to a sporting event, you can take it with you. If you're sitting around with family and friends and watching a football game, you can be stitching. So that's one of the things that has certainly not changed with our craft, that we can get so much personal enjoyment out of it while we're doing other things. And I've never seen anybody sort of enumerate why people do cross stitch, but I imagine that's kind of at the top of the list. So this time next week, I'll be in sunny Florida, where I'm teaching and attending at least one stitch-in, and then having some vacation time with some stitching friends. And so I don't know how much, I don't know whether or not I will get videos made every week while I'm gone or not. But once I get back, I'm going to try to get back to a regular schedule. And I hope that the fact that I've been sort of sporadic in producing these things hasn't diminished your willingness to tune in when I do make one. So until I get around to doing it again, I hope that you will stitch happy and stay safe, and I'll see you then.